Yeah. Can you hear? Yeah. Okay. We apologize for this delay. We're going to technical issues. Can you hear now?
Okay, there's thumbs up.
So before we begin, we would like to review the status.
Estamos escuchando la grabación.
¿De dónde serás?
Ya apagué el micrófono, ¿eh?
Solo que se esté percibiendo.
De... ¿Se lo puedes explicar?
Yeah, we're having a loop. Auf Deutsch sagen wir. Sincronizados. Test. Okay, good work now.
Bitte was sagen, weil
Can someone who guys no, it's okay. Can you hear us now?
Okay.
egal, you say something, just to
To hear you?
try and see it. You can interview.
Can you please talk so you can hear you?
Someone, please say something. I think we resolved the problem now.
Now I can hear you, but I can only hear.
Okay,
I think we just tell Florian to start and then
Yes.
we try. And
I think Florian,
we're trial and error.
Florian, can you say something?
Yes, I can say something.
No,
I
can't.
I can hear you only if it's just one person speaking and if that person speaks directly into the notebook.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's barely audible.
Okay, now we hear you.
Okay, so now it's
we're going just to say a few words before we begin with we wanted to thank everyone for being here, for participating in this first workshop on metaphors. And we hope this is the first edition of several months without all the technical problems.
First timer.
Yeah. We just we're going to present a little bit the idea that we have together with Stephanie Kraft. We have found out that we coincide in a lot of issues, that we were in a lot of subjects that we were dealing with, and we decided to melt for working with things for people who are interested in the same subjects. And well, yeah, that's it. I wanted first to present my Mexican colleagues who are going to take part of this event. Dr. Arturo Romero from the UAP.
Hi.
And Dr. Cesar Moreno from the UAP as well. Pineda, sorry. Did you say Moreno?
Don't mind.
So, I give the floor to Steph to present.
yeah. So you forgot to present
I
yourself.
forgot to present myself. I'm Saida. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, so I'm Stephanie Graf, for whoever doesn't know me, and I want to welcome my colleagues from Austria, from the research project membership Metaphors Storekeepers. So we have Florian Pistorn here already and Lauren Markowitz. Andreas Oberbrandacher is going to join us in a couple of more minutes. We also have another speaker who is not connected to the research project, Rainer Stummer, who cannot be here right now, but he will join us also later. So thank you guys for adjusting your agenda to be up late and work late so we can be here in Puebla. It's a pity you cannot be here in this city with the highest density of churches in the world. I learned with a beautiful view on the volcanoes. So an apology again for the delay and the technical problems. We have a high-tech room here, but the problem is that no one, that humans have to deal with the technology. So I just want to say, because we also have a live stream and you never know how many people are listening to the format. The workshop is going to be in English. We have short inputs of 20 minutes, more or less. Everyone is presenting individual work in progress, let's say, and we're going to share some ideas in the discussion. The first discussion is going to take place directly after the talk, and then afterwards we will join the discussions of the individual papers in groups of 2 or 3. If there's someone listening who prefers to pose their questions in Spanish, we can do that, and maybe together try to translate.
Yeah.
So that's not a problem. So I think that's
it.
Okay. Well, I may say something. Just hi everybody. Welcome. We're very happy to be here at the WAP and to have such a very important guest. I'm talking about everybody. So feel welcome. My name is Arturo. I was already presented. Thank you, Saida. It's complicated to explain, but let's say I'm like the chair of the postgraduate department, and we're very happy to be here. And so feel welcome. And right, if someone from the web wants to put a question through YouTube, you can do it too. It's open, and that's it. You're welcome, and we could start.
Yeah.
So we're gonna start with Florian Pistor's talk. If Florian is ready.
My own concern with, will someone present him, or
No.
just like that? Okay, so let's get it.
The floor is yours.
Yeah. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'm sharing my presentation. So you can see the presentation, I hope.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much for organizing this workshop. I'm delighted to speak to you and share with you my thoughts. Thanks to all of you who've had a part in organizing this, and special greetings also to my two dear ones from Vienna. My talk is called The Albatross About Our Neck, and I'll get right into it. One of the many sobering realizations one comes away with from reading Primo Levi's Auschwitz memoir, If This Is a Man, is that the horror of the Nazi camp pervades not only every minute of the inmates' waking life, but also every single moment of their fitful sleep. As soon as they fall down on the squalid straw mattresses, their bodies numb with exhaustion and close their eyes, their daily nightmare morphs into a nocturnal one. According to Levi, it is one dream in particular that haunts them night after night, until they have to get up and swap their nightly torture once more for the daytime agony. In it, the inmates are back at home among their kith and kin, eager to recount what they have gone through. But once they begin to tell their story, they find that their family and friends do not listen, that their words fall on deaf ears and arouse nothing but indifference. Upon waking, Levi writes, my dream stands before me still warm, and although I'm awake, I'm filled with its anguish. And then I remember that it's not just any dream, and that since I arrived here, I've dreamed it not once, but many times, with hardly any variations in setting or details. And he wonders, why does it happen? Why is the pain of every day so constantly translated in our dreams into the ever-repeated scene of the story told and not listened to? It is this distressing thought of finding no audience for what he has to say that fuels Levi's incessant urge to put pen to paper after the defeat of Nazi Germany. The result is an oeuvre that comprises poetry and prose, fiction and non-fiction, and has been lauded as much for its tenacious effort to ponder a past that refuses to be mastered as for its literary finesse. With the publication in 2015 of the complete works of Primo Levi, English-speaking readers now have the opportunity to study this remarkable outpouring, which runs to nearly 3,000 densely packed pages in its entirety. Those who do so will find that Levi likens his attempts to make others listen to those of an obscure figure of late 18th century poetry, the protagonist of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. As Levi puts it in the periodic table, it seemed to me that I would be purified by telling, and I felt like Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, who grabs the wedding guest on the way to the wedding to inflict on him his story of evil. One stanza of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner seems to be particularly dear to him. It comes towards the end of the poem and reads, since then, at an uncertain hour, that agony returns, until my ghastly tale is told, this heart within me burns. Levi not only uses this as the motto for The Drowned and the Saved, his last work, and makes the final two words of its first line the title of his collected poems, Ad Ora Incerta, but even composes a poem, The Survivor, whose first stanza is but a slight variation thereon. What is it about the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner that causes Levi to believe that it somehow captures the essence of his desperate need to bear witness to the destruction of European Jewry? And even more important, why should we care almost 80 years after the fall of Hitler's Reich? In the next 15 or so minutes, I will try to answer these questions by zooming in on the central metaphor Coleridge's poem has introduced into the English language, the metaphor of the albatross. My paper is split into two parts. The first part focuses on the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner and the role of the albatross within it, arguing that, grafted onto the work of Levi, it is best conceived of as a figuration of the Nazi genocide. The second part draws on the thought of Hannah Arendt and Ernesto Laclau to contend that it is now more imperative than ever that we engage with this gull-like bird. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is first published in 1798 as part of Lyrical Ballads, a collection Coleridge co-authors with William Wordsworth. Although it contains only 23 poems, this slender volume changes the course of literature, ushering in the greatest revolution in English letters since William Shakespeare, the Romantic movement. As I'm about to show, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner sits uneasily both with this revolution in general and with the collection in which it appears in particular. Before that, however, I should say a few words on what the poem is about. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner starts with the eponymous character accosting a wedding guest just as he's about to join the celebrations consequent on the occasion. Although at first the wedding guest doesn't want to be bothered, he soon relents, bewitched by the old man's glittering eye. The story the Ancient Mariner tells him concerns a sea voyage that he and some 200 men took a long time ago. After a smooth start, he explains, the cruise ship was suddenly hit by a violent gust and pushed towards the South Pole. Where, he continues, the ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. This bleak scene was brightened, though, by the appearance of an albatross, which the crew hailed in God's name, convinced that it was a good omen. And indeed, aided by a strong wind, the ship soon managed to set on a northward course, the albatross accompanying it. Thinking the Ancient Mariner's story has come to an end, the wedding guest interrupts, God save thee, Ancient Mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross. After this inexplicable killing of the albatross, the Ancient Mariner goes on, disaster unfolded. The ship reached uncharted waters near the equator and was becalmed, its crew slowly running out of food and drink. Unsurprisingly, the mariner was blamed for the fate, with the crew's anger leading to a curious punishment. Ah, well a day, what evil looks had I from old and young. Instead of the cross, the albatross about my neck was hung, which thenceforth would encumber his every movement. Shortly afterwards, the Ancient Mariner continues, the ship was approached by a ghostly vessel. On board were Death and a woman he calls the nightmare Life in Death, gambling for the crew. The latter won the life of the mariner, the former the lives of all the others, whom the mariner was then forced to watch drop down one by one. Now all alone upon the open sea, surrounded by corpses, he felt dejection washing over him, prompting him to curse the snakes glittering in the water as slimy things. Later on, however, he discovered their beauty and blessed them, and it was only then that the spell he had been under since his crime was broken. The selfsame moment, the Ancient Mariner tells the wedding guest, I could pray, and from my neck so free the albatross fell off and sank like lead into the sea. After that, and many a further detour, he finally reached the shores of his native country. And once he had firm ground under his feet, the mariner begged the hermit to hear his confession, his penance being to pass from land to land to relate his story. Since then, he closes at an uncertain hour that agony returns, until my ghastly tale is told, this heart within me burns. It is a testament to the powerful imagery of Coleridge's poem that the albatross dangling from the mariner's neck has since become a popular metaphor. Today, the term refers either to a seabird or, as the Oxford English Dictionary puts it, to a source of frustration, obstruction, or guilt from which it is difficult to rid oneself, a burden, an encumbrance, a hindrance. One of the examples given by way of illustration is the following. Sir Alan had long been the albatross about the government's neck. Another, from Merriam-Webster's website, reads thus: fame has become an albatross that prevents her from leading a normal life. This metaphorical meaning of albatross casts new light on both the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Levy's work. As regards Coleridge's poem, the albatross qua metaphor changes our perception of what its author has accomplished. I've already mentioned that the Rime of the Ancient Mariner stands in an awkward relationship to both lyrical ballads and the Romantic Revolution. It is now time to specify what I mean by that. My contention is that, seen in its context and in the light of what has been said thus far, Coleridge's poem is itself a kind of albatross. Consider what Wordsworth says in a very short advertisement that opens Lyrical Ballads. The poems, he tells us, are best understood as experiments. They were written with a view to ascertain how far the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes of society is adapted to the purposes of poetic pleasure. In the preface he writes to the second edition, he goes even further. The poet does not write for poets alone, but for men, he argues, and in accordance with the spirit, the principal object was to choose incidents and situations from common life, and to relate and describe them throughout as far as possible in a selection of language really used by men. The task of poetry and the hallmark of romanticism, so thinks Wordsworth, is the poetic elevation of ordinary language in order to render the mundane in all its beauty. This, however, is not at all what the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the first poem in Lyrical Ballads, does. For one thing, its subject matter is decidedly supernatural, dealing with many a thing not of this world. For another, and this is especially true of the original 1798 version of the poem, it is riddled with numerous cumbersome archaisms. In the advertisement, Wordsworth tries to play this down by asserting that the Rime of the Ancient Mariner was professedly written in imitation of the style as well as of the spirit of the elder poets. In a letter to Joseph Cottle, though, he vents his frustration, saying that Coleridge's poem has upon the whole been an injury to the volume. I mean that the old words and the strangeness of it have deterred readers from going on. In a sense, then, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is itself something of an albatross, a burden weighing down the revolutionary volume in which it appears. Yet, upon reflection, matters are more complicated than that. For one could also argue that it is precisely by failing to exhibit the qualities Wordsworth believes poetry should possess, that it comes to function as the background, allowing us to appreciate them in the other poems of the collection. If this is so, then the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is just as important to the success of Lyrical Ballads as a springboard for romanticism as Wordsworth's poems are. As for Levy's oeuvre, the albatross metaphor helps us better understand why he compares himself to the Ancient Mariner. To be sure, there are some crucial differences between the two, the most important one being that Levy, unlike the Ancient Mariner, is completely innocent. He has committed no crime whatsoever, and so there's no need for him to do penance. Yet he, too, has a rope slung about his neck with an albatross on it, cutting into his skin and encumbering his every step. It is the death of millions, an evil so extreme that, as Arendt puts it in The Origins of Totalitarianism, it can neither be adequately punished, nor forgiven, nor fully comprehended. And like the Ancient Mariner, Levy feels compelled to keep alive the memory of what he has been forced to witness. Towards the end of The Drowned and the Safe, he sums up the gist of his efforts as follows. We have to be listened to, it happened once, and it can happen again. This is the heart of what we have to say. The rationale behind this is that in order for us to live in a non-totalitarian society, we must never forget the crimes of totalitarianism. We must never forget the crimes of totalitarianism and nip in the bud anything that, if carried out, threatens to lead us there. Once again, the albatross plays a constitutive role. Only if we accept it's hanging about our neck, Levi seems to say, can we hope to slouch towards a freer society. This is precisely the point I will now try to make by turning to Arendt and Laclau. One of the most intriguing things about the origins of totalitarianism is how Arendt approaches her subject. Unfortunately, she does not explicate her methodology in the book itself, thus giving rise to many a misunderstanding. It is only in a reply to a review by Eric Voegeling that she divulges the methodological concerns that preoccupied her while writing her first magnum opus. The problem originally confronting me, she reflects, was simple and baffling at the same time. All historiography is necessarily salvation and frequently justification. And in the light of this, she continues, her first problem was how to write historically about something, totalitarianism, which I did not want to conserve, but on the contrary, felt engaged to destroy. In the origins of totalitarianism, this problem of method translates into a problem of style. As Arendt puts it, I parted quite consciously with the tradition of sine ira et studio, and to me this was a methodological necessity closely connected with my subject matter. In other words, totalitarianism is not something to be reflected upon from a position of cool detachment. For as soon as we aspire to an attitude of dispassionate neutrality, we automatically become complicit in its preservation. In the origins of totalitarianism, this non-objective approach is most evident in the section dealing with the Nazi concentration and extermination camps. Here, the proposition from which Arendt starts is that if it is true that the concentration camps are the most consequential institution of totalitarian rule, dwelling on horrors would seem to be indispensable for the understanding of totalitarianism. Yet the only thing that can afford to tarry with the horrible, that indeed cannot cease doing so, is the fearful imagination, or, as the German edition of the book has it, the anticipatory fear, die antizipierende Angst, that something similar might happen again. This fear not only helps us in our grapple with the Nazi genocide, but can also lead to what Arendt calls a mobilization of political passions. Thus, the fear of concentration camps and the resulting insight into the nature of totalitarian domination might serve to invalidate all obsolete political differentiations from right to left and to introduce beside and above them the politically most important yardstick for judging events in our time, namely whether they serve totalitarian domination or not. Whatever the differences structuring the social realm, the moment we indulge the anticipatory fear of totalitarianism, they fade from view, uniting us against a common threat. As I see it, this notion is most profitably understood in terms of Laclau's concept of antagonism. But what is antagonism? Laclau takes his cue from and builds on Ferdinand de Saussure's insight into the differential constitution of identity. Language, and by extension all signifying systems, he reminds us, is a system of differences. And each identity or value is what it is only through its difference from all the others. From this it follows that each and every act of signification implies the whole system of differences. For there to be a system, however, we must be able to define its limits, which in turn requires us to determine what is beyond those limits. Yet this is precisely where the rub lies. If we really take seriously the idea that identity is differentially constituted, we cannot posit an ultimate ground. Nor can we think of yet another differential element, as this would leave us with an indefinite dispersion of differences that could not but thwart any act of signification. Laclau's ingenious solution to this conundrum is to interpret the limits of the system in terms of pure negativity or radical otherness, which threatens the system while at the same time constituting it. This is what he calls antagonism. Its effect is highly ambivalent. Because it establishes the systematicity of the system, it renders possible the differential play through which each element acquires a certain identity. Insofar as it poses an equal threat to all the differences, though, it also undermines them by making them equivalent to each other, interchangeable with each other as far as the limit is concerned. Thanks to this unstable compromise between equivalence and difference, the social is never fully constituted. Antagonism is the limit of all objectivity. What appears a dry exercise in deductive reasoning allows us to flesh out Arendt's notion of an anticipatory fear. For there to be conflicting beliefs, different convictions, and a variety of political outlooks, what Chantal Mouffe calls agonistic pluralism, an antagonistic frontier must be drawn that radically excludes and yet remains haunted by the threat of totalitarianism. This is what Arendt's anticipatory fear reminds us of, once more evoking the image of the albatross as both what encumbers us and what makes us stagger along. And in the light of the dramatic rise in anti-Semitic attacks in recent weeks, it seems to me that we are called upon now more than ever to harness this ghastly bird to our breast. Thank you.
Yeah, Florian, are we on? Okay, Florian, thank you so much for your talk. We now directly pass to a discussion of it. So whoever wants to start with questions and remarks, please do so. Maybe make use that I'm already on the microphone to formulate one of many questions and doubts that I have. Connected to the endeavor of romanticism in a way, and also connected to the funny concentration we have in this small workshop on people interested in theology and metaphorology. So I think, to say something very bold and very general, romanticism has in its endeavor to find alternatives to pure enlightenment reason, makes use of a secularizing idea of theological concepts. And when you quoted the poem of the mariner, there was a line that I was interested in that goes something like, instead of the cross, the albatross was hung, no? So there seems to be a kind of a substitution or transformation of a religious belief into this strange metaphor of the albatross. So I wanted, and then again, this substitution is reversed, no? At the end, because the mariner gains his belief back or something like that. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts maybe on this connection between the religious realm and the metaphorical one.
Well, I think there certainly is some sort of connection. This poem, as far as romanticism in general is concerned, I think, and that might be a very dull or banal answer, but it really depends on the poem you look at. Wordsworth, for his part, whom I've also mentioned, was quite a conservative guy and I do think that he, well, but if there is a secularization in his poems, it's more or less accidental. Whereas when you look at someone like Byron, I think, or Shelley or Keats, things might be different. As far as the Ancient Mariner is concerned, well, it's such a rich and complex poem, and I think one could very well make secularization one's primary concern and reread the poem in this light.
Thank you. Who else wants to comment?
Yeah.
I think it's good, no?
Okay. Can you hear me well? Is it clear? Okay. Thank you very much, Gloria, for your presentation. I was wondering, I read your handout, and well, you quoted Laclau, And I was wondering because we have like the conviction or the idea that there is actually something like a system of language and a system of reason and a system of, let's call it, let's call it rationality. And what we're tackling today, I mean, at least partially, is the fact that when we don't have the words or rationality to make sense of the world, then we resort to metaphors. But my question, and it's not only a question for you, it's for all the participants, is on the one hand, we tend to agree on the fact that we need another type of language to address what cannot be said, either because it's horror, political horror, or because it belongs to a mystical sphere. But on the other hand, it seems that the opposite is also true, that language does not make any system at all, and reason doesn't make any system at all. So why I am saying this? Because when you quote Laclau, he tends to totalize language in such a way that the only way to express horror demands a short circuit. And I don't know. I don't know if we really, I mean, the problem of metaphors really has to do with the limits of reason, because it seems to me that reason itself is complicated in itself and full of inner contradictions. So I don't know if the idea of an outside is really the leitfaden for thinking metaphors. Like the idea that there is some radical exteriority to reason, for we don't know anymore what reason is. So these are my thoughts. Thank you. I just shared them, and I was told that this was the idea instead of really making interesting, precise, and good questions. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your question or your remarks. I didn't get all of it, but I'll just improvise and pick out what I think I've heard. Well, as to the relation between language or reason, or the system of reason, and metaphor, I think one of the most basic two things we could say is the first, that thinking or reason cannot do without metaphors. This is the first thing, and the second is that we cannot make a clear distinction between conceptuality and metaphoricity, that conceptuality always threatens to request, as it were, to dilute into metaphor, and vice versa. Metaphors may harden into concepts. When it comes to the destruction of European Jewry, I think it's significant that all the common terms we use are more or less metaphors. When you think about Holocaust or Shoah or Churban, which are all terms that originally refer to something quite different, and are nevertheless used to refer to the killing of the European Jews, and are in this sense metaphors. And one can make the claim that it's precisely because we lack a proper term for what has happened, or for what happened, that we must, by necessity, resort to metaphor, which is not to say that we will at some point come up with a metaphor we are totally comfortable with. Yeah, that would be my thoughts on your question or remarks.
Thank you, Florian, for your exposition. When you were talking about canal, you talked about relation between method and style. And so my question is style directly linked to political positions? Because I think, for example, that in the traditional ways of totalitarianism, there is a very serious gray style. I cannot, or it's hard for me to imagine a joyful style.
Sorry if I interrupt you. I could hardly understand you. Maybe I think it was something about the relation between methodology and
style.
And style.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Style. Yeah. Yes. So I was asking if you can, if there is a relation between style and political positions, if style is directly linked to political positions, because, for example, I cannot think of totalitarianism without this very serious style in its discourse. So I cannot imagine, for example, traditional totalitarianism with a joyful style. So is there a relation between style and political positions, or for you, is it possible to think about a new ways of totalitarianism with a different style? I don't know, a style that is not serious, great. I don't know if I'm explaining myself.
Yeah, I think I know what you refer to. Well, needless to say, there's no definite style to talk about these matters. And as someone who sometimes wastes his time watching British comedy on YouTube, I can tell you that they deal with the subject of totalitarianism in quite a different way than we do. So I think, of course, no subject is defined or can be or there's no subject necessarily requiring a particular style. But of course, the style you choose has an impact on what you end up saying necessarily.
We have another question.
I have another question. Do you have another?
No.
Okay, I think we have a couple of minutes more. Florian, I wanted to go back to Primo Levi and the burden which lies in this story that is told and never really listened to, which, if I understood you correctly, was your connection to the albatross metaphor. So I think we could read this problem as a failure, either on the side of the one who's telling and missing to bring the point over in a way, or at the side of the listeners who are not interested or are tired or just don't want to confront these horrors in the story. But I think it's a problem, we were talking about it yesterday, Saida, of trauma itself, that there is no story that can be brought across. No? Like there is it's a vacuum that's always circled by stories, but the core of the trauma can never be touched by words. So I wanted to ask you about this solution that Primo Levi gives, because I think the solution is somehow in the never again, and in the even though the story cannot fully be comprehended, if the listeners get the point of the never again, then somehow this burden falls off. So I wanted to ask you if this is again if you see this again as a sort of substitute solution, or do you think it's a real answer to the trauma that happened to the survivors of the concentration camps. It's difficult to sharpen it, but you know what I mean.
As co-workers, I hope I do. Well, as for the proposition that there's always something left that cannot be put into words, I would totally agree. There's a wonderful book by I've forgotten her first name, but her last name is Horowitz, called Voicing the Void. And in the light of this title, I would argue that the task is to try to voice what cannot be voiced, to say what cannot be said, to bring to speech the unspeakable or the unsayable. It's in a similar vein that Dieter Übermann speaks of images despite of all. It's about speaking in despite of all, or in spite of everything. As to your question concerning the albatross, well, as I see it, Levi never gets rid of the albatross, and a testament to this is that he is never done telling his story. And neither, by the way, does the ancient mariner, I think, at least not in a metaphorical sense. Because, to be sure, the literal albatross falls from his neck, but the metaphorical one, urging him on to tell his ghastly tale, as he puts it, never leaves him, more or less. And my point, I think, was that when we think of totalitarianism or the Shoah in particular, that we too never get rid of this albatross, and somehow have to engage with it.
Thank you. So, do we have any questions on the Zoom or YouTube? Maybe we should check that. And otherwise, I saw that Andreas already joined the meeting. So welcome from Puebla. We don't have any more questions?
No. No.
Okay, so I could see that Andreas joined the meeting, but I cannot see him here. Andreas, are you there? And can you hear us? You have to activate your microphone. Okay, Andreas is here.
Hi, yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry, first of all, for being late and for being also in the midst of a family situation. It's because today is the day where all parents are meant to go to the school with their children. And so I just came back from there and I'm home with my children at the moment. And that means that it could happen that my children call for me, and I hope that that won't happen. But in case it will, I will have to briefly interrupt.
That's perfect for us. So I would say, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello everybody. So first of all, let me briefly ask if you can see my screen, if that works. Okay, happy to see that, happy to hear that. My second challenge is that I didn't find the time to print my actual paper, so I have to improvise a little bit. And what I'm doing is I'm reading my paper from my own mobile phone while presenting. So I hope that goes equally well. What may it mean to speak of the stranger? It is certainly a very familiar word, perhaps even too familiar, which is why I would like to begin by questioning it. Quite at the beginning, of the third session of his seminar on hospitality, which Jacques Derrida held in Paris from November 1995 to June 1996, and that was published in its entirety only this year. He emphasizes that we could very quickly lose ourselves in the semantic richness of the word étranger, and we could form so many sentences, too many sentences. Given the plurality of meanings and usages of this seminal word that is spinning around, persistently circulating, there is the risk, says Derrida, of a vertigo. A vertigo, I quote him, of the becoming foreign, of the strange, or the becoming strange of the foreign. End of quote. And yet, or precisely because of this vertigo of meanings and usages, there is also a notable effort to die down words, to fix them. Indeed, it is reasonable to say, states Derrida, that the word foreigner has its firmest, and in the French original, he sticks with the word étranger by outlining its multiplicity of meanings, has its firmest and most constant anchoring, which is a juridical, political one. And what typically goes by the name foreigner is what we call every other human being who does not belong to a social body that goes by the name nation or state. To speak of the stranger, according to Derrida, means thus to conventionally refer to instances of ipseity as home, family, civil society, the state. Let me exemplify what it may mean to speak of the stranger in such a way, in such an ordinary way, that the vertigo of meanings and usages is reduced, one could perhaps say repressed, through anchoring this word to a dominant jurido-political discourse while reflecting instances of ipseity. David Miller's book, Strangers in Our Midst, can serve as a particular but telling example, insofar as Miller addresses the very question if it may make at all sense to use the word stranger to refer to people that are said to be non-members, non-citizens. Why call immigrants strangers, and why assume a homogeneous we in whose midst they are being set down? Asks Miller, and immediately responds, I believe though that it captures how immigration is often experienced, at least on first encounter in settled societies, most of whose members have a sense that they and their ancestors are deeply rooted in a place. While the rest of the book does only rarely use the word stranger, it does so only in passing, one can indeed argue that this preliminary passage is key to understanding Miller's further arguments as a conventional and conformist anchoring of meanings and usages. Simply put, the first encounter that he mentions reflects something like an archetypical scene that confronts, I quote him, settled societies, or put differently, a sedentary people with unsettling others, non-sedentary strangers. It amounts thus to a juxtaposition, if not, we could also use a loaded word here, to apartheid. While those who are said to be properly settled are, as he says, deeply rooted in a place, are in the right place, so to speak, strange others are referred to as an uprooted and displaced people, a comparatively shallow form of existence. Du kannst schon mitschauen. It is a typical framework of registering, of framing strangers, because the experience that Miller mentions to lend authority to his arguments is not an experience in the plural or a general experience, one that would be made by everyone equally. It is rather the experience of those who he identifies as belonging to their place of origin, those that are still in their place. It is the alleged experience of those who legitimately dwell that Miller uses as a pretext and as a subtext to turn all others into proverbial strangers. Through such processes of designation and demarcation, or of alienation, that become operational as Miller advances his arguments why compatriot partiality is reasonable and defensible, the stranger is repeatedly addressed, even though mostly in indirect terms, and used in such ways to reassure that one can rightfully be at home, that this is my home, that this is where I belong. The stranger thus appears as that unruly and unhomely counterfigure in Miller's text that is interpolated only to construct a sense of ownership ranging from the family to the nation state. Or, to word it differently, the stranger is welcomed in Miller's text only insofar as the stranger is kept apart. To speak of the stranger is thus an opportunity to delimit and legitimize a sense of at-homeness. This becomes evident, for example, in chapter 4, where Miller is reflecting upon closed borders. He states right at the beginning, he's not arguing that borders should always be kept closed, but rather to show that policies that involve selecting some migrants and excluding others are legitimate. That the state, as a home at large, according to Miller, has the right and even the responsibility to decide who gets in and who stays out, who is admitted and who is rejected. It is interesting to note that while Miller is aware of how contentious the question, how is legitimate occupancy to be established is, he argues nonetheless that it matters more to discuss the source of occupancy and to reflect on the connection between occupancy and jurisdiction, which one could find quite strange, because if it turns out that occupancy cannot be justified, at least not in a conventional sense, then territorial jurisdiction too becomes problematic. Contrary to those critiques that assess border regimes as undemocratic institutions, Miller contends that border controls and all measures related are not really coercive, but rather preventative. To make his point, Miller invites his book's readers to think about the following scene, which recalls the very first, the archetypical scene. When I prevent someone, says Miller, I remove one option from the existing set, but leave many others available to be selected. If I prevent a stranger from entering my house, he still has plenty of alternative places in which to seek accommodation. So prevention needs much less justification than coercion in general. End of quote. This analogy is not random, but exemplary for the instances of ipseity that are at work in Miller's text and that contribute to creating and staging a homely scene. That of the stranger all of a sudden on my doorstep, that of the stranger seeking entrance, that of the stranger that can be rightfully turned away from my house. The consequences of these arguments, based on the premise that there is a stranger, as if it was certain that there were strangers, but are there really? And that the stranger does not belong to us, become readily noticeable when Miller continues and claims that border controls are actually not coercive since, I quote him, the immigrant is being prevented from doing something, entering the United States, for example, that he may very much want to do, but he is not being forced to do anything else in particular. he is left with all the options that are available to him in his home country, together with the options that are open in other countries that will take him in. The US authorities are not trying to direct his life, even though they may be frustrating his wishes by excluding him. If the immigrant enters illegally, he may become subject to coercive means to remove him, just as I may have to call the police to get rid of an unwelcome intruder in my house. But that does not imply that initially refusing entry was itself coercive in either case. What I tried to briefly show through this admittedly quite biased reading of selected passages of Miller's text Strangers in Our Midst is that the term stranger performs a series of functions, which is to say that it is a performative figure of speech and that these functions are in one way or another related to the intent of gaining and maintaining control over the instances of ipseity and to convey a sense of ownership, like territorial ownership. Our midst, so to say, is organized through literally referring to strangers. According to Derrida and his efforts to come to differing terms, the tendency to speak of the stranger in such ordinary ways, in ways that promote an order in the name of the same, generates two, I quote Derrida, types of typical consequences that could be summarized along these lines. On the one hand, referring to the stranger as a conventional figure comports that any act of hospitality, as generous as it may be, is an act that is determined and delimited by the home itself. It cannot be but a strictly restricted hospitality that always already runs the risks of tipping and of turning into hostility. This is to say that institutionalized relations to the stranger are basically an extremely ambivalent, and here I use a seminal expression of Derrida, hospitality. And Derrida will use this neologism only in the 7th session of his seminar. On the other hand, says Derrida, anchoring meanings and usages of the word stranger solely in juridico-political discourses would inscribe, I quote him, the meaning of foreigner and so of hospitality within the limits of a determination of the limit, hence of the Lehman frontier borderline, which by containing all overspill of meaning would also keep us from taking into account all the turbulence, semantic or pre or ultra semantic, that might upset or blur such limits. End of quote. To consider these two consequences that Derrida discusses in detail together entails that any effort to bend or interrupt the cooperation of hospitality and hostility that we see currently at work in many parts of the world requires also an effort to rework what it may mean to speak of the stranger. From a metaphorological angle, which I think is compatible with Derrida's deconstructive moves, especially if we think of metaphorology in metonymic terms, that means how metaphors are repeatedly drifting and shifting, this could first of all mean that the stranger is itself a metaphor. To speak of the stranger as a metaphor has itself multiple consequences. It means that we cannot take it for granted that there are strangers, that the stranger is a particular being, that the stranger is per se a non-citizen or a non-member. Or to quote from Sarah Ahmed's book, Strange Encounters, to avoid such an ontology that fetishizes the presence of strangers, we must refuse to take for granted the stranger's status as figure. End of quote. Rather, we need to rethink the stranger so that its manifold manifestations as text, as subtext, as pretext is connected to processes of signification, to how modes of belonging are attributed, assigned, but also rescinded, revoked, through the name of the stranger, be it as migrant, as refugee, as foreigner, as alien, as clandestine. And this is to say that to speak of the stranger as a metaphor means to take notice of how this word is used to estrange, to render people strangers. Because strangers, says Ahmed, are not simply those who are not known in this dwelling, but those who are, in their very proximity, already recognized as not belonging, as being out of place. Such a recognition of those who are out of place allows both the demarcation and enforcement of the boundaries of this place, as where we dwell, end of quote. For this reason, it means also to research how the word stranger is deployed, not just literally, but also between the lines, how it is operationalized as an argument that pretends that we know who the stranger is, that we have the authority to define others as strangers, that it is basically our right to decide to what a stranger is entitled. Such an endeavor is all the more pressing as there are massive pushes to delegitimize people with a precarious residence permit even further and to create extremely hostile environments for those demanding a more hospitable stay. Consider, for example, Trump's plan for his return to the presidency in 2025. What he plans is major detention camps for, how he refers to them, illegal aliens, no due process anymore, that means no process hearings, and deportations by the millions. Or to quote Trump's speech in the book from September this year, following the Eisenhower model, we will carry out the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. And this means, in American terms, Operation Wetback 2.0. While I'm not suggesting that learning to speak of the stranger as metaphor will readily revolutionize how we organize polities as inclusive, exclusive entities and how membership rights are allocated, I would nonetheless argue that it is still a beginning and a trajectory of thinking that cuts through dividing lines. Thank you.
Address, Papa.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Let's jump right into the discussion.
Who wants to start?
I will try to build something on something quite interesting you said at the end. Can you hear me well?
Unless your microphone is off, so we don't know if you hear it.
Sorry, I can hear you, but I just didn't find the button.
Okay.
Yeah, but I can hear you. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. It's not. I didn't have the time to build a question. There are just few ideas that came to me when I listened to your talk. It has to do mainly with this interesting approach that you're making between the stranger as a metaphor in itself, because it has like two sides. On the one hand, it makes metaphorology directly political, and on the other, it gives meaning to a justified demand to change the way we conceive someone who's not sharing the same nationality as we do. So again, on the one hand, you politicize metaphorology, and on the other hand, you metaphorologize this political issue, which at the same time, how to say it? It's like double level, politicized and double level, because you already politicized the typology. So I don't know if that's a clear idea. I just wanted to say that this approach is quite interesting, and the demand to change the way we understand this word is also valid. But I would like to hear some more about how it could, in policy and in political discourses, change the way we live this word situation.
Yeah, thank you very much for your remarks. I would absolutely agree. It's one of the possible, and there are multiple, one of the possible entry points to confront contemporary border regimes. Obviously, border regimes do not just take place as discourses, and I would not be saying that philosophy has that kind of importance that these discourses in the end regulate how borders work nowadays, but very much like in the history of slavery and other forms of violence, I would say that a number of philosophical discourses do also participate in the ways forms of violence are legitimated. And so this entry point, this metaphorological intervention here, would give us indeed some opportunities to address how certain words, certain contentious words, are deployed in text, by pointing out that these words are not just some kind of natural or straightforward references to particular beings, but they are acting as devices that create, on the one hand, designations, but also demarcations. And to understand them as metaphors then allows us to understand how arguments are put at work, how discourses are contributing to establishing a sense of normalcy, which, at least along the lines of Derrida, are very often in these juridical political terms revolving around the idea of the home in one way or another, even though we all know that this home has always been a very phantasmagoric entity. There was never such a home, and even less so nowadays do we have access to such homes. I mean, not just in terms of all the forms of displacement that are currently taking place, also forms of displacement that are related to the mobilities of work necessities, but our homes are all interconnected just through internet and so on. And so this idea of being finally at home has always been phantasmagoric. So yes, it's an entry point. It's an entry point where we can at least start to have a controversial discussion of how we do think about ourselves. How do we create we-ness by constantly estranging others?
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to? Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Perfect. No, I was very glad that you brought Derrida, because I would think that's especially important when we're discussing about metaphors, because I don't know what you think, but there is the instability of the concept of metaphor. That's already a problem. If there is something like a concept of metaphor, or we just speak of metaphors, through more metaphors, or even if there are metaphors of concepts, right? So this is very Derridian. But I don't remember exactly where. I think it's on La Mythologie Blanche. But he says something like metaphors. I don't know, and this is my question. Metaphors, or the idea of a metaphor in general, supposes that there is some non-metaphoricity, that there is some proper sense. So we're talking about metaphors as something that is needed to go beyond some limits of language or some use of language, but at the same time, the very concept of metaphor destroys itself. And so I don't know what you think, but the question, the question raised by Saida and what you were talking about, to speak of the consequences and the effects of language, you have a way to presuppose some sort of more than language, not something alien to language, but some more to language, so that language can have effects. And I want to say it I want to put it in other terms. Difference as such, difference with an A, creates differences, but at the same time abolishes those, so to speak, second or creative differences. And this makes the political very difficult, because you could say that, well, I don't know what the other is, because it's really never clear when the other is other, and it's not clear when the self is the self. So I understand the political consequences of mobilizing the frontier or the border between the proper and otherness, but Derrida seems, I don't know, to move between 2 points. On the one hand, he wants to claim absolute otherness of the other, following Levinas, but on the other hand, he claims that otherness in general abolishes itself, so to speak. So I would say I would put it just in yet another sense so that it's clear. On the one hand, otherness points toward the absolutes, and on the other hand, it points to absolute relativity and something like Selbstaufhebung of difference. So, in which sense, and this is really the question: do we need some stabilization of what is a metaphor and what is not a metaphor, in order of metaphors to be effective, right? So I know this is kind of confusing, but so is Derrida. His skills is charged.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It is a very tricky question, and I cannot but try to provide some kind of tricky answer to that.
Yes, thank you.
I would say that there is perhaps a certain relationship between the word, as a word, metaphor, and the stranger itself. Both are, in a way, traveling words. I would absolutely agree with you that there is a certain tradition also of researching metaphors that works with concepts of metaphors that are being defined and then used in a certain empirical form of doing research, which is, in my opinion, also quite legitimate. But the moment we are trying to get a closer sense of what a metaphor actually is, we realize very soon that it cannot be really located. It cannot be really tied down to say, well, this is a metaphor and this is not a metaphor. But this constant shifting and floating around of words, also in terms of Jacques Derrida's effort to reflect on difference is already signaling that it cannot be stabilized. There is no metaphor as such, that any metaphor is already linked to this metonymic drifting and shifting, which in a way also means that there is no clear border between what is a metaphor and what is a metonymy. And in that sense, I would assume that despite a lot of other differences, there is also some similarities with the word stranger and the metaphor, where the word stranger can appear in so many different forms, in so many different ways, that it takes no final and stable form. In his third seminar, Derrida tries to dwell on this by suggesting that there is this constant vertigo related to these potential meanings and usages that are constantly gravitating around. Sorry, that's my daughter in the background who is moving chairs.
I also have a son, I understand.
And he argues that at the same time, we find also this kind of movement which is trying to anchor these meanings and usages, or what you have said, that there is something absolute in terms of otherness and something that is at the same time absolutely relative. At the same time, the moment Derrida tries to address this, and I think he does address this, his text does also take already a particular form. It cannot but take already a particular form. But this form that it takes is never a final form that is there once and for all, because every new reading of it does already slightly turn the parameters. And so I would not expect from a methodological angle to finally resolve the stranger as if it were a purely conceptual issue. For that reason, that what I expect from a more methodological angle is to provide some kind of punctures in a discourse that as a political and philosophical discourse on migration that presents itself as full, as reasonable, and as complete, where through a focus on such forms of shifting, we have certain entry points where we can cross, where we can confront the argument by trying passages that in a way hopefully cross already over the text and allow us to rethink the ways we create social political entities, relations, the way we think about dwelling nowadays, the way we think about displacement. It's I know a very abstract hope, but the concrete world as it is nowadays doesn't give us any more hope than that, perhaps.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, a very small commentary about what Arturo said. I remember Paul de Man, a Derrida's disciple, who I read him very long ago, but he says something like every philosophical concept starts as a metaphor. But it opens the question about if there is a first metaphor, I don't know, an archie metaphor, I don't know. Anyway, so this is just a commentary. And I have a couple of questions, a short one and a long one. First, the short one. You mentioned another expression for the stranger, and it is the alien. And so my question is, does it have another metaphorical effects or nuances compared to the stranger? That's the first one. Well, if you want to answer that first.
Yeah, thank you so much also for your initial comment. I mean, it's interesting to note that, at least this is perhaps also how we could put it, that if we think of concepts and origins, the word concept itself can also be a metaphor because it is connected to ways of conceiving, to conception. And in that sense, what I would like to say is that not even the term concept is a concept that is free of metaphorical meanings. In one of his essays on sources and origins, the metaphorologist Blumenberg is pointing out that these two are already metaphors in the sense that they usually are linked to sources of rivers. In German, it would be Quelle, where the very origin is already a dirty origin, dirty in the sense that it's already contaminated by too many meanings. So it is certainly a fantasy, a very strong fantasy, perhaps of ours, that we are able to finally come back to the very beginning of language. So we are moving in a world structured by language that we have all inherited, but without finding this proper origin. And thank you also for the question related to aliens. Does this have perhaps, that's the way I understood it, different implications? Does it create other differences, the way it's being used? Yeah, I couldn't come up with one single answer. In Sarah Ahmed's book, Strange Encounters, it's very interesting that she starts her reflections by recalling that the word alien for her recalls all those sci-fi movies about aliens. So we could say that in terms of a very popular way of imagining relations, the term aliens is already an interesting term because it shows how this term has also become something like a term that goes beyond the planet itself by addressing life forms that are non-human, that we encounter here in fictional settings. And there seems to be a double translation happening here. On the one hand, we translate a number of fantasies that have to do with the histories of border crossings and people moving from one place to another into the outer space. And at the same time, we are translating back a number of these fantasies of encounters with strange aliens from other planets or universes back to the way we are addressing nowadays people as illegal aliens, as complete other life forms, as if they were, that different from us. So I could imagine that the term alien has this perhaps particular connotation, but that's one way of trying to address it.
Did you have another one?
Yeah. So the other question is, you suggested that the words like the Greek genoi, in other words, in Occidental languages, they don't have the same nuances as stranger, and I agree with that. And I remember a quote from Herodotus, who writes, I'm going to read that line. In his history, he writes, the Lacedaemonian, the Spartans, called genoi to the barbarians, barbaroi. This could seem a very naive quote, but it's not naive because he's suggesting that Hanoi, for the Lacedaemonian, for the Spartan, in the context of the war with the Persians, that the Persians, that the barbarians are like friends to the Spartans. So he's pointing out that the word Hanoi doesn't have negative nuances. So I think this quote supports your thesis. But then the negative, both concepts, Hanoi and Barbaroi, they don't have negative nuances until the war with the Persians. So my question is, do you think that there is a natural and spontaneous, peaceful relation with the other that only later with a conflict or a war or something like that becomes hostile? I don't know if I explain myself.
I think so. Well, I mean, I consider myself also to a certain extent being a researcher in the field of peace and conflict studies. So in that respect, I would not think that there ever was something like, let's say, really a peaceful relation, but that early relations were already very conflictive relations. But obviously the history of violence, this can make a huge difference how people deal and dealt with conflicts. It's my understanding, and I wouldn't claim any kind of particular theological knowledge in this respect, but it's my understanding that when historians like Herodotus or Thucydides are compared, we find already in Greek antiquity two at least very different or very distinct ways of relating to historical experiences, but also to ways, forms of otherness were designated. Some scholars are suggesting that very often Thucydides is referred to as that more empirical researcher, more accurate, more trying to really think about his time and his experiences. So let's say the more empirical researcher, perhaps nowadays one would say the more positivist researcher, whereas Herodotus was more thinking also in fabulous terms about times that he couldn't have possibly witnessed, people that he couldn't have possibly met. But at the same time, his more fabulous narrative is interesting because he refers to other people in ways that are quite respectful, or in ways that embrace a certain plurality. So it's interesting that his more fabulous ways of narrating histories are indeed also combined with a certain interest in seeing a plurality of life forms. So that's my very naive answer that I would give without, being able to really ground this in philological research.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, I think so.
I also have a short remark, or maybe there is are we silenced? No, we are. There is advocate's question concerning Sarah Ahmed's argument and concerning her shyness or her reluctance to use the figure of the stranger, but also the figure of the migrant. No, she protests against the slogans also like "We are all migrants," because she thinks that this would be a procedure that invisibilizes concrete individual experiences and renders concrete particular people part of some amorphous mass. So my doubt is if this resistance is not also a resistance to universalization in a way that any intellectual procedure that we could call induction, be the result a metaphor or a concept, would necessarily invisibilize the concrete particulars that we are inducing from. And like this is my general doubt if this is not an impossible endeavor to fight against every sort of induction. And the particular doubt I have is if there's a special preoccupation with the figure, like with the image that has a concrete delimited shape already, a form with limits, and if she would prefer a concept to an image.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot answer this question for Sarah Ahmed, but the way I read her and the way I think one could read her is that, I mean, the book starts with the argument that we were all used to this stranger danger formula where we were confronted with a long history of the stranger being the personification of a potentially evil other. And now what you may call postmodernity is also referring to a transformation of this stranger danger paradigm, so that all of a sudden there is some kind of stranger fetishism. We are all in a way strangers to ourselves. The strangers are welcome, and so on. And her preoccupation and intervention goes in the direction to, first of all, saying that this stranger danger paradigm and this stranger fetishism is two sides of the same coin. So where does this leave us? It's certainly no option then to try to think about the stranger as a metaphor in terms of, yeah, we are all strangers in the end, so it basically makes no sense to even try to recognize somebody as a stranger, but rather I would argue to try to have more nuanced researches on how the term stranger is deployed in arguments. This can be scholarly arguments, but can also be popular arguments, without necessarily there being the term stranger present. Because if we take once again the book of Miller, which is titled Strangers in Our Midst, the term stranger, I looked it up, pops up only a very few times as a term itself. So if we were just looking for that particular wording, it wouldn't really say much. But the entire book is organized in such a way that it needs as a reference or as a counter figure that of a supposed stranger to create this sense of belonging and of homeness. And here, I think the research can be interesting to understand how particular figures and counter figures are created, how certain arguments work, and how modes of belonging very often also are staged through such arguments. So that's what I think could be relevant. But it depends then also with what kind of texts are we dealing? Are we dealing with normative analytical texts? Are we dealing with populist discourses? Are we dealing with artistic interventions that disrupt certain order of meanings and usages? I think there is still room for pluralizing what happens here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to finish this first panel, and we're going to have half an hour break, and we're going to begin at 12. So
that's your 7 p.m.
your 8 p.m. Oh no, 7. Yeah.
Okay, so
Thank you very much.
see you in a moment.
Thank you.
Sabe todo. Hay alguien, mira, hay unos en la sala de espera.
Ah, ya me acordé del chiste. ¿Cómo se dice vendedor de puertas en inglés? ¿Cómo se dice vendedor de puertas en inglés?
¿Vendedor?
Door seller.
Vendedor.
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 Vendedor de shopping.
Okay.
Más bien en Spanglish, ¿no? ¿Cómo se dice en Spanglish? Aquí le juntas el de vender.
Sí, también podrá funcionar.
No estoy escuchando. Pero no ven.
Ah, sí. Sí, 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 sí. Sí, sí. Hay que simplemente. Ajá, eso.
Okay.
Ya.
So welcome back. Sorry for the delay. We had
Issue.
we couldn't find the doorkeeper. So we couldn't enter our room. So maybe we give it a minute or so till everyone settles down. In the meanwhile, just a quick remark on the procedure. This time we will hear the three presentations in a row and then have a common discussion at the end. ¿Dejaste entrar las personas de la sala de espera?
¿Cómo?
Había unas personas en la sala de espera.
Ahí están las
¿Ahí están?
chillas. Y usted. Voy a ver si hay más, pero creo que no.
Vamos con esto.
So if you allow me, I can, just moderate and say who's next, who's beginning and who will be next.
¿Para quieres que te mande mi Ana?
Pueden dejar, ahorita te doy acceso a tu.
Si quieres, voy a hablar.
¿Aquí no hay internet?
Si quieres la contraseña.
Ajá, trabajadores, estudiantes.
Mira, está.
Estudiantes, ok.
Ajá, 4 estudiantes.
Ajá. Por
Eh,
suerte tengo.
¿Sí?
So, okay, we're going to begin this next or second panel. We will hear firstly Arturo Romero from WAP, Politics as the Borders of Nature. Please.
All right. Well, let me just move this a little bit. Can you hear me? Guys from abroad.
Maybe a small thumbs up if you can hear as well.
Okay, all right. Just wait, I'm just solving a minor problem. Am I sharing or not?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. Hello. All right. This. Wait. Tuck tuck. Okay. Now this. And now this. I think. Right. Okay. So I have 20 minutes. Now I'll turn this thing on just to keep track of time. Yeah.
I can keep the track of time if you want.
Okay. Okay. First, well, thank you very much for being here. I'm going. Actually, the name I gave Saida is wrong.
Ah,
No, but not completely wrong. So the actual title should be Politics at the Borders of God and Nature.
did I say it?
So I will tell you what is this going to be about because I probably will not have the time to explain everything. So first idea, what is a metaphor? I think what can be a metaphor in terms of as a research in language. That's like the first idea. But the second and more important thing, what I want to tackle is the borders or how politics is defined by two borders, or so to speak, two domains, both theological. One is God or theology, political theology, and the other is something that I call natural theology. But I will try to explain what's this. So first of all, I will try to say very, very briefly what I think metaphors are, and second, what this sort of reading or interpretation of metaphors allows to understand from the political discourse. So this is contentious. This is terribly contentious, but I will say it anyway. What is a metaphor? And there are two ways of defining words. I mean, you can, or no. There are two ways to relate to definitions. One is to take them as the truth of the word, and the other is just to accept that you have to define a word and then not take it very seriously, definitions. But so, what is the metaphor? What I want to tell, what I claim is that metaphors are links, ways to link words. We substitute one word for another in order to expand meaning. The other day, Saida was talking about what are metaphors supposed to do. They don't explain. That's something. They complicate things. They do not explain, and I agree on that point. But the real point or real issue is if metaphors say something, or if they are just like the coloring of a book, the illustrations. Because we find that all the time that we can say things properly, and we can add metaphors just to color it up, or to make it more beautiful, or to convey some specific meaning, even to resort some to rhetorics. But it's not, so to speak, shouldn't have anything to do with the content. So in this way, we assume that metaphors are improper. And this is very, very close to the point we were discussing about Derrida. There is implicit in the concept of metaphor that there are proper meanings, and that metaphors deviate from what we would call proper or natural. But this is just a hypothesis. I mean, I don't want to. It's not my idea to oppose logic and metaphors, but I want to show, or at least it's my interest to show you what is at stake in terms of connections. We could say that logic is hierarchy, right? You have the axioms, and you have theorems, and you can prove by the rules of inference. Right, so there is something absolutely hierarchical in logical deduction, and this is what we can call, in a certain sense, proper. It would be at least more contentious to say that we have metaphors in logics. Of course we have, but it's not, since it makes epoche of the content. Really, what is important in logic is functions. So what we're doing in logic or in logical deduction is to prove hierarchically when we have premises to arrive at a conclusion, or if we have an axiom and then we come to a conclusion, to a proof of a theory. We prove it's true or false. But if this is a connection, if deducing is a sort of connection in which we preserve truth, because we know if and only if premises are true, then the conclusion must be true also. So this is a connection between ideas, but it's vertical, and you have axioms given. But metaphors, and this is what I claim, what I want to share with you, are not hierarchical or hierarchic, but heterarchic. Heterarchic is a concept used in mathematics, in logics, and then in system theory, but it has to do not with verticality, but horizontality. Now, it's clear for us that metaphors do not deduce nor prove anything. But what do they do? Not what they are, but what do they do? Or my definition is more linked to the operation of metaphors, and metaphors link different domains. But if metaphors exist at all, it's because there are different domains of sense. We wouldn't need metaphors at all if there weren't different domains of, let's say, at least discourse. Now, domains of sense are not only different by content. I mean, yes, we can speak of politics and nature and science, and even among sciences, we have science of life and science of physics and whatsoever. They are not only different in content, but they are also different in logical structure. That is, if you want to reason within the quantic world, you need a certain logic. And if you're reasoning in the realm of morals, you have different logics. Why am I saying this? Because we tend to say that metaphors are there for the non-logical, or for the illogical, or for the metalogical. What I claim is that there is no logic as such, but there are different logics, and one of them is the standard, deductive, traditional, so-called Aristotelic logic. But there are also different logical systems, and metaphors have their own logic. That's the point. Because if we are to develop a metaphorology, and we say from the beginning or from the outset that metaphors are different from logic, we cannot develop a metaphorology, right? So the question is, what is the logic? What is the logic of metaphors? And what I'm saying, I was very appealed by the name of your project, which is metaphors as doorkeepers, right? So what does it mean? Even in that metaphor about metaphors, you have doors and borders, and above all, the idea that borders can be crossed. So linking this to the commentaries, I forgot who of the guys were spoke about it. Okay, doesn't matter. Metaphors are not arbitrary. If they were arbitrary,
No, you meant Andreas?
maybe.
Or Florian?
Yeah, one of those guys. Oh, yeah, those are the guys. Sorry. Now, I took some time to reflect upon this idea of metaphors as I don't know. I have another word. I forgot doorkeepers. Doorkeepers. But it's not about bridging different domains. Because the idea would be, okay, we have one domain, we have another, and then we have like the horizontal bridges between domains. And that's one of the ideas. But as Saida was saying the other day, metaphors enrich. They do not explain. When you explain something, you put it in already known terms, and you kind of lower complexity. But with metaphors, you increase complexity. So the idea is not just communication to put something in terms of other thing, and this is where your idea, I mean, of the whole work comes into play. It's a gate. Metaphors are really gates, but I don't know if keepers, but they are gates which make possible horizontal communication between domains. So it doesn't have to do with the non-logical, but it doesn't have to do with the meta-rational. It has to do with, with different type of connections. And the whole point is, what is the connectivity of the world and how metaphors enable us to move differently through the connectivity of the world. So, so in this respect, what I want to show is that politics or political discourse or philosophical political philosophy has to open gates or several gates, one leading to the natural and the other leading to the divine. So if you pay some attention, these are the classical three objects of the so-called metaphysica specialis, right, from Wolf, which you have God, you have the world, and you have the soul. So the political as a human domain has to communicate or has borders with the divine and the natural or the cosmos. And it's precisely the definition of the political is always a definition of the borders towards the divine and nature. So the first idea, and when I gave Sai the title of my intervention, I was thinking about how politics is the constant definition of the border between the divine and nature. I remember there is a German philosopher, Odo Makwa, and he has a very interesting thesis about nature. He says, well, we tend to interpret or to say that in modernity there is something like the concept of nature, which is there are actually, or at least three of them. First of all, we have nature as a place of order in the Cartesian way, or in the Kantian sense. Nature is order, its law is necessity. But on the other hand, I'm contending with that concept of nature. It's not logos or civilization, but other concepts of nature. There is, so to speak, a struggle to establish what should nature be. So the other concept of nature being there is romantic nature. That is, nature as the place of, he says, das Heilige, or das Heilige, and also das Heile. Is the place which has to be saved because we human have lost our way. But there is still a third interpretation of nature, and this interpretation of nature is the place of impulses, or how it's translated, the Triebe as drives, right? So you have Hobbes and you have Freud. If you start, understanding the field of different interpretations and the contending interpretations of nature, you also understand the different borders between these interpretations of nature and the divine, because all of them have a different stance towards the divine. And you also understand not a simple opposition between so-called nature and spirit, but a complex territorium, so to speak, in which the political is being defined. So let's start. I know it's very common. It's the Leviathan. Yeah, I know everybody. But there's something interesting in this image, in the frontispiece of this famous edition of the Leviathan, in which is coming to metaphors. We need a monster. And it's very interesting how politics always resorts to monsters and animals. I don't know if you remember, in the 19th century, cartoonists
develop a language of speaking about nations in terms of animals. For example, I don't know if I have it here. America is eagle, England is lion, China was a dragon, Spain was, I don't know, I think a rabbit, France was the cock, etc.
The beer, Russia?
The bear, right. Russia was a bear. Russia was a bear, exactly. So it's really, or at least it calls the attention that politics also claims animals and not plants, for example. It's always animals and fierce animals. So, but the Leviathan, we know it's one of the beasts of God, which he plays. But at the same time, we know it's an artificial monster. So what is at stake in this image is the very definition and the border between the monster, which is natural and which it belongs to the ancient mythology and cannot be controlled but by God. Right? It's not in the hand of humans to control the Leviathan. And this is the possibility to create for the very first time something like a beast of God. And it's in the hands, more or less, of humans. But at the same time, it has in both hands the divine and the earthly. It has a sword, and sword is always the image of earthly power. It's pure violence, right? And on the other hand, it's I don't know if it's a staff or a crosier, but in any case, it represents the power of the church. So we can see that the monster really can only emerge from two sources: earthly power, sheer violence on the one hand, and the divine of the other. And this is one way to solve the tension or the border, to resolve the conflicting border between the divine and the natural. But to speak in more contemporary terms, because I know I have
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Okay. Regarding God, speak more about our own time. I think that regarding God, now our political horizon is defined regarding two interpretations of the divine and nature. On the one hand, or regarding God, is political theology. And political theology is a theory of sovereignty, and sovereignty defined as exception. But exception of what? Nature. And I want to link two very different people: the idea of exception in Schmidt and the idea of exception in Kant. Because it's one form of radicalized subjectivism which makes possible political theology. I remember a quotation from Franz Rosenzweig in a letter he addressed to Hans Ehrenberg. It's called the Urzelle of the Start of Redemption. And he says, Kant is for me the biggest of all philosophers for one thing: to make freedom the miracle. He says the miracle, der Wunder, in the realm of phenomena. That means that subjectivity is a miracle in itself, and it's the absolute interruption or the exception in the laws of nature. So it seems like political theology relies on the absolute opposition between nature and subject, so that subject affirms itself as exception of the laws. And nature can be taken not only as evident nature, but also as the world, rather doxa. And we can recognize this even in Badiou. Badiou also speaks of the subject as being the exception to the world and emerging out of nothingness. But on the other hand, and I will finish with this because I see I have no time. On the other hand, its theology is not only defined in terms of nature or what is the subject regarding nature, but there is also a play in politics, in the definition of politics, what is nature? And what we find is that those who oppose political theology and subjectivism say it's nature, the way to vanquish the subject, or at least to depotentiate the powers of the subject, is to say it's nature, it's pure nature. But as you can see, political theology finds not only in the sovereign, but in the figure of the state, the instrument for the realization of exception. But on the other side, those who oppose this subjectivism and do not believe on the powers of the state and the sovereign, what do they believe in? The market. So the market is the current version of nature as self-regulating God, of immanent God. Because it's not nature, you know, as a set, as a mere set of connections and causes and effects. There is also divine in the market, because such, and it is divine in political theology, the subject. In this case, nature is sacred because it's us humans that interrupt the good functioning of the market, the good functioning of nature, and it's us that have to acknowledge the holiness of nature, because nature either is wise or, as we say in the market, it tends to order and equilibrium. And this is the theological part of nature. It's written that the best will always happen in nature. And this is what we call equilibrium on the one hand, and in the other, this is precisely what Mandeville and Smith claim. This is all our private vices are turned into public virtues. So the power of nature is to purify our horrible hearts, full of evil and envy, and turn them through some invisible hand, and that's the theological part. But it's not a deus ex machina. It's immanent to the functioning of nature to correct itself so that the best of the possible worlds, to put it in Leibnizian terms, really happens. So these are just some ideas. I don't have any more time. I had 34 more slides. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Arturo. Maybe in the question sessions, you might talk about more on what you wanted to explain. Next talk, we'll have Stephanie Graf with talk entitled Unconventional Joints, Metaphors in the Thought of Hans Blumenberg and Carl Schmitt.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna just try to talk you through the handout you already have. And I think it's a wonderful connection because I'm also going to talk about political theology and its relation to political metaphorology. So I'm going to start with a quote by Jakob Taubes that tries to characterize the relationship between Schmitt and Blumenberg, and thus also characterizes the relationship between the method of political theology, if we might call it a method, and the method of political metaphorology. So much is said about this unusual triangle, Taubes, Schmitt, and Blumenberg, and the improbability of their intellectual exchange, but I think it's not the place and time to elaborate further on this. Only I want to mention that this quote is from the book Political Theology of Paulus, which is not something Taubes had written, but it was edited by Jan and Aleida Assmann after Taubes' death. And it was based on a conference he gave resuming his conversations with Carl Schmitt, because Taubes, when he knew that he was sick of cancer and was going to die soon, he was had realized his endeavor to have some very long conversations with Carl Schmitt on Paulus. So the quote I'm starting with is the following. Everything that Schmitt sees as realities are metaphors for Blumenberg. Blumenberg, the only German philosopher among the living who interests me, is a metaphorologist. Schmitt asks, what is behind the metaphors? I asked about the political potentials in theological metaphors, just as Schmitt asked about the theological potentials of legal concepts. So this is Taube speaking, and I have the slight suspicion that he occupies here actually the position of Blumenberg for himself, because I would like to think that Blumenberg asks about the political potentials in theological metaphors. So in the following, I'm going to try to contest this scheme Jakob Taubes offers of realities versus metaphors, and try to negotiate if this is really an opposition that we can make. And to do so, we must first look at the self-understanding both have of their methods. So for Schmitt, political theology, and here comes a quote from his Political Theology 2, are statements by a jurist on a structural relationship between theological and legal concepts that imposes itself in terms of legal theory and legal practice. So this is an understanding of political theology which is quite far removed from something like a substantial belief or religious belief in the strict sense of the word. And another element of Schmitt's political theology could be illustrated by what has been called the secularization theorem, the famous supposition that all relevant concepts in modern political theory are actually secularized theological concepts. So there is a movement here in time that supposes that there is a first field of theology and the transference to the political. So we can say that in a diachronic way, the political and the theological are linked through this secularization theorem, and in a synchronic way through the thesis of structural affinity or analogy. So this is two sides of the same coin of political theology. And now, as maybe most of you might recall, the relation or the conflict between Schmitt and Blumenberg initiated with Blumenberg's book, The Legitimacy of the Modern Age, where he criticizes the secularization theorem, but actually situates Schmitt in proximity to someone like Karl Löwit, who supposes in his Meaning in History that there's some sort of substance of theological content that continues on living in a disguised way in the political realm and in a secularized world. So this would be, for example, a substance of eschatology that continues on living, or sort of disguised eschatology that continues on living in the teleological philosophies of history. So Schmitt protested against this view on his political theology and affirmed that there is no such substance or such disguise as Löwit has claimed in his own thought, or as he sees political theology. But it's still not clear how he gets to his statements of structural analogies. Obviously, the point is not also for Schmitt a genealogical reconstruction or conceptual history of these terms, but some kind of different use. And to clarify this specific reality, I want to look at a proposal by Bernhard Conrad, who emphasizes the rhetorical moment of political theology. So Conrad states, and you have this quote also on the handout, the actual conceptual historical moment of a political theology does not consist in the formation of formal analogies, nor in a genealogical reconstruction of political theoretical concepts, but, as will be shown, in the attempt to extract a rhetorical dynamic from the metaphorical halo of theological figures of thought. So the halo in German, this is my translation, was the Hof. It could be translated in many different ways, but I think the halo, sort of aura, might be the proper translation here. So I think that the emphasis on rhetoric and on metaphoricity that is something that Conrad also extrapolated from Blumenberg himself, because he also says in the Legitimacy of the Modern Age that political theology, there's this quote, I think you have it here, political theology is a metaphorical theology. So now we came from a political metaphorology to a metaphorical theology. And I think that this shift to the rhetorical dimension of theology can clarify some problems. So following a little bit more the proposal of Conrad, who for his part bases himself on Skinner's idea of rhetorical paraphrase as the situational re-evaluation of a behavior or a situation which is expressed by means of metaphors, can help us to take us out of this dilemma to fix a substance of theology or some proper theological content, and permits us to look more at the use, the function, and the situation these figures of thought appear in. So the prerequisite for a rhetorical situation, according to Conrad following Skinner, would be a lack of evidence, or what we also call it, like a void of expression, explanation. There's some situation that needs to be elaborated in by means of language, and there is a compulsion to act, and this might be maybe the properly political dimension. And this seems, I would like to claim, to go hand in hand with Carl Schmitt's idea on radical conceptual sociology, on this idea of radikale Begriffssoziologie, which he explains as the following way. The prerequisite for this kind of sociology of legal concepts is therefore radical conceptuality. It is a consequence that has been taken as far as the metaphysical and theological. So it's more an intensity, like the realm of the theological is more an intensity or radicality than a proper field or a separated semantic camp. So to have such a sociology, which is equivalent, according to Schmitt, to political theology, just means that concepts are thought through to their most radical consequences. Maybe the distinction between friend and enemy to delimit the realm of the political would be quite a good example for such a method of radical sociology. And now, because I think how
You
much time
still have like 7 minutes.
Okay. So I think I already made that point that Schmitt's understanding of political theology is not necessarily of a spiritual content as we might in an everyday understanding of theology suppose. And there is also an interesting dialectic here between in the directionality of political theology, because it's something Jan Assmann later had claimed for himself, that the direction of political theology not necessarily goes from the theological to the political, but from the political to the theological. So I gave you also a quote here on the handout that Schmidt and Lepper made in the afterword to the Blumenberg-Schmidt correspondence, that says that Schmidt himself turns the tables on political theological relations and regards metaphysical images as projections of political constellations. So this also contests, in a way, this assumption of some sort of a theological substance. So I want to add to the proposal of Conrad, which consists in this the emphasis on the rhetorical use of political and theoretical interests of these figures, with the idea that both Schmidt's theological realities and Blumenberg's theological metaphors provide some sort of orientation patterns for complex structures, metaphysical structures, that cannot be grasped otherwise. So it's an attempt to read basically history, because I connected here metaphysics with philosophy of history. Maybe we can come back to this point in the discussion. It's the attempt to read history in a meaningful way, not as a unstructured chaos. And to give you an example, and with this I want to end, that might illustrate how Schmidt and Blumenberg try to provide these patterns, but still think in a different way. I want to give you the case of the Katechon, which is could be a theological figure of thought, it could be called a theological reality, or it could be called a metaphor. The Katechon. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this concept, this idea of the one who stops or delays the coming of the end of days, Paulinian concept that Schmidt and many others take from Paul. Let's support for Agamben afterwards. Okay, so I want to read you this interesting quote from the Glossarium by Schmidt on the Katechon, which goes like this: I believe in the Katechon. For me, it is the only way to understand and make sense of history as a Christian. You have to be able to name the Katechon for every epoch of the last 1,948 years. So it was like since the birth of Jesus Christ. The place was never unoccupied, otherwise we would no longer exist. There are temporary, transitory, fragmentary holders of this task. So what Schmidt is trying to do with this Katechon is a transposition or parallel, maybe an overlap reading of a long duration of time, a long duration of history, and the unicity of particular historical events. So the Katechon provides a sort of scheme to do that. And then in the next quote, with which I am already ending, you see how Blumenberg historicizes this idea of the Katechon and reveals the interest behind it, because in the Christian theology, the Katechon was not always an important idea, and Blumenberg explains it the following way. Having become identical with the power of the kingdom, it is the sheer consequence that this power also represents the Katechon. But all these are forms not of the simultaneity of history and eschatology, but of the reversal of the eschatological promise into the promise of the postponement of the eschatology, of the last days. So what Blumenbach says here or implies here is that the outlook of the end of times once was directed against political power. So there was a hope for the end of times to end tyrannical rule. This was in early Christianity before Christianity actually pacted with political power. So in the moment Christianity is aligned with political power, it loses like the eschatological, like it loses that potential, and now the delay or the postponement of the end is desired and incorporated in theology, and this might confirm the idea that the directionality of the political and the theological actually goes from the political realm to the theological, and then there are doctrines, theological doctrines that justify these interests. Good, I think I'm through. I will leave it here. And
Okay.
Looking forward to this.
Okay, thank you very much. We will now hear. I
Blurry, no?
Yeah.
Can you sharpen us?
Open it.
Ah. That's better.
Oh my head.
We will now listen to Cesar Pineda from WAP with a talk called Theological Metaphors in Heidegger. Please.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Saida and Stephanie for the invitation. It gives me the opportunity to think about some issues in Heidegger that I've been thinking of. And since you are the experts in metaphors, maybe you can help me. Because rather than statements, I have questions and problems here. I start. This contribution is itself a metaphor, taken from Enrique Dussel, who recently passed away just 2 weeks ago, and his studies on Marx's theological metaphors. In Marx's work, for example, money and capital are presented as the reversal of Christ, and humanity sacrificed its lifespan, the most valuable thing they have, in the same way that the ancients sacrificed their children to the god Moloch. Likewise, the history of emancipation that points out to a classless society could have the same structure as the eschatology history of Revelation. The explicitly atheistic Marxist thought would have the same power without these theological metaphors. Benjamin's well-known thesis on the theological sign of the revolution still remains its relevance. However, this paper will focus on the theological metaphor of another apparently distant thinker, Martin Heidegger. First of all, a general list of Heidegger's main theological metaphors will be made, and secondly, I will ask what are the effects derived from such metaphors based on the thesis that metaphors, like language, are not a mere instrument that can be used in a neutral and indifferent way. The main hypothesis is that the thought of Martin Heidegger has a similar structure, if not the same, as theological thinking. Perhaps we can talk about a theology without God or a God without theology, but is there still a theology without God? Heidegger once said, Ohne diese theologische Herkunft wäre ich nie auf dem Weg des Denkens gelangt. Herkunft aber bleibt stets Zukunft. Which is a very Freudian statement, by the way. Here, Heidegger says that without this theological origin, he wouldn't be led to the path of thinking. How to evaluate fairly the presence of theology in Heidegger? This is an extremely complex question. However, I expect to contribute to the clarification of that question by pointing out some of the main theological metaphors in Heideggerian thought. There are at least five metaphors, theological metaphors: Verfallenheit, Entgelassenheit, the historical revelation, concealment of being, the idea of a proper people, folk, for the inception, infant, and the less known metaphor, eschatology of being. In this early thought, still under the influence of St. Paul, Heidegger proposes Verfallenheit or renounced. I don't know how to translate it to English, the state of fall. At the state in which we fall away from our proper being. An issue that takes form in science as the complex relation between Eigentlichkeit and Uneigentlichkeit, authenticity or inauthenticity. In the Pauline invitation, we must choose between two kingdoms, that of man or that of God. For Heidegger, we must assume our open and possible way of being, or ignore it. In any case, a radical decision opens up. But the shadow of St. Paul will continue to be present in the late Heidegger. The well-known expression Gelassenheit, which is translated in Spanish as serenidad. I don't know how translated to English, Gelassenheit. I don't know.
Serenity?
Serenity, maybe. Which Heidegger takes from Meister Eckhart, has a deep Pauline inspiration, as Pedro Jesus Teruel points out. In the midst of the decision between this human kingdom or that of God, between flesh and spirit, far from an exclusive dichotomy, St. Paul proposes a simultaneous yes and no to this human and material kingdom. After all, if we would simply deny this world, we would fall in various ways of cruelty and violence. Because, for example, we would not care about the suffering or the pain. Thereby, Gelassenheit is not an escape from the world, but a new and transformed disposition to it. Heidegger takes this disposition to refer to the simultaneous yes and no with respect to the problem of technique. Moreover, rightness is another idea with Pauline resonances, as it marks the time as kairos, just like a long awaiting for the appropriate moment. This leads us to a second metaphor, the idea of a historical revelation, which is crucial for Christian theology. González de Cardenal asserts, the theologian must open himself to the revelation of God, allowing himself to be illuminated and shaped by faith, welcoming it in the place where it is found. End of the quote. But the idea of a place, becomes crucial as it implies a concrete chronotopological way of revelation. Hans Urs von Balthasar also affirms, all Christian theology is conditioned by the situation. Otherwise, it would not be theology of a historical revelation. End of quote. The central point here is that the Christian God is not an abstract entity, indifferent to the suffering and concreteness of the human being, but rather he shows himself and makes his way in the midst of human concreteness itself, which is, by the way, a very Hegelian idea. In a similar way, for Heidegger, being is not an abstract entity, substance detachable from the concrete existence of humanity. Rather, its revelation and concealment occurs in the history and just as history. In this framework, we will find another relevant metaphor, that of the appropriated people fault, which we also find in Heidegger. In the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 6 and 7, we can read. By the way, this is a free translation. I don't have the English Bible, so this is a translation from the Spanish Bible. The Lord has chosen you among all the people of the earth, so that you may be a special people to him. If the Lord has preferred you and chosen you, it is not because you are the greatest of nations, since in reality you are the smallest. These are words to the people of Israel. End of the quote. In the narrative of a historical revelation, God cannot appear at once for all people, culture, and countries. He must make his way into historical concreteness. To do so, he must start from an appropriate people. Likewise, for Heidegger's ontological thought, which is the narrative of a first and another inception, este und anderen Anhang. Historical donation of being can only occur through a designated people, namely the Greek and the German, respectively. But one thing must be clear, and this is a difference between Heidegger on the one hand and theology and Hegel on the other. For Christian eschatology, history points to and awaits the greatest moment of fullness of time, that is parousia, in which revelation, apocalypse, will reach its maximum degree. For Hegel, the history of the absolute culminates in the highest degree of self-knowledge, luminosity, and transparency. In contrast, with Heidegger, we have a negative of that image. Instead of culminating in the maximum luminosity and revelation, the history of being reaches its maximum concealment in the technical age, in which metaphysics reaches the culmination of its history. Such an end is called by Heidegger in his black notebooks eschatology of being. By the way, he crosses out being. Our fifth, and this is our fifth theological metaphor. However, Heidegger is quick to clarify that this is not a theological approach. On the contrary, the eschatology of theology is only thinkable from the eschatology of being. And this is a quote from the Black Notebooks. Ohne die Eschatologie des Seins erfahren zu haben, können wir nicht einmal den Gedanken einer Theologie ahnen. So he points out that the eschatology of being is a precondition for the theological eschatology. This is an enigmatic quote, for it suggests that a theology is still possible in the framework of the eschatology des Seins. Many questions arise from the metaphors shown so far. Can we really extirpate theological contents by transferring metaphors from one field to another? Heidegger himself maintained that language is not a simple, neutral instrument that can be used as a tool. Rather, language opens the paths of thought. So we must ask, what paths are open in Heideggerian thought by maintaining theological metaphors? On the other hand, it is clear that Heidegger has no theological aims, at least not in the Christian sense. It is false that Heidegger is a crypto-Christian, as many have pointed out, which is clear in his Black Notebooks, where he explicitly distances himself from Christianity, to which he directs severe criticism. However, the structure of a theological thought remains. A historical donation that can only occur in the concreteness of historical people, waiting for a propitious event, paradise, that is incalculable for human beings. Are we facing a theology without God? Does it still make sense to talk about a theology without God? Perhaps we should take a step back to what Karl Rahner, who was a student with Heidegger, Jesuit theologian, in his work Here des Wortes. Soberly, he talked about philosophy and religion, which is not yet theology, since it is already based on faith and revelation, theology. The philosophy of religion is rather an ontology of human existence, which asks whether it is appropriate for the divine to be revealed in it. If it decides to reveal itself, since there is also the probability of refusal, then Heidegger's thought would have a structure similar to such philosophy of religion. But would this be a philosophy of religion without God? Theology without God, religion without God, God without religion or theology? Maybe the crucial point is the not where all of this is found, the preposition without. Perhaps this without is the sign of what Heidegger at some point characterized as the last God. But we are still far from thinking about the singular deprivation that happens in this without. So without this, I don't know, this is a metaphor. What happens with this without? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we can begin our session on questions and answers. So if you have questions, let me check the YouTube channel. But if you have questions
There.
between,
Yes.
you may ask it.
Well,
I have some questions as well, so I put myself on the road.
I want
Yeah?
it's because that it happens that you never have the time. So in the end, I've seen many times you saving.
Okay. I have comments and questions for all of you. First of all, for Arturo, I was when your talk began, I was immediately sent back to an author that I appreciate a lot, which is Lévi-Strauss. And I was thinking about him and about the relationship between your talk and his thoughts about logics, because one of his main statements in the Savage Plot, La Pensée Sauvage, is precisely what you said. So there's no university in logics. There can be also logics in savage thought. So that's why there is, that's why he chooses this word, because it's not savage in the sense of uncultured, but in the sense of another order. Some translators prefer to say, I don't know how the terms in English, silvestre instead of salvaje. Because that means
I think wild.
Wild, yeah.
wild, yeah.
Wild.
But wild still has this connotation of being other than wilderness. It's like the other of culture, right? So in any case, the problem with this, well, the thing I wanted to say is that what you said has to do with Lévi-Strauss' main thesis, which is that myths and non-Western ways of ordering reality obeys to a certain logic as well. So there's no unrationality in savage and wild thought, but it's just other ways of classifying, because actually that's what myths do, according to Lévi-Strauss. They are like clusters of logics of classification. Classification, however, obeys to sometimes in this wild thought obeys to the hierarchical order. So there's no, I don't know if the distinction between hierarchy and horizontality can help us to understand what metaphors do, because this savage thought can also be hierarchical. So there's no exclusive direction in metaphorical thinking. It can also be hierarchical, or it can also be, as Steph was saying, like bidirectional, right? From politics to theology and theology to politics. So there's no, I don't know if it's not a risk again, that maybe doesn't, it's not helpful to take, to establish this severe distinction between like logics that work in this sense and logics that work in the other horizontal way. let me see, I wanted to say something else. I found it very interesting when you defined politics as this permanent awareness of this border between the divine and the nature. So we could say, as we were discussing with Andreas in the last panel, that politics is also a metaphor for metaphors, as Andreas was saying that stranger is a metaphor for metaphors as well. So another way to discuss the political status of metaphors, which is the subject I am also interested in. Yeah, that was just a comment. Thank you. I don't know if I should.
Let's join them, no?
Should I?
Yeah.
I had a question for you, Steph, concerning the link you're establishing between Schmidt and Blumenberg. It has to do with what Schmidt calls radical sociology. And I was let me see. Yeah, I was wondering if we can see it as a link, or rather an extreme difference. So because radical sociology, as I understood it, has to do with concepts. And the metaphysical project, Blumenberg's metaphysical historical project, has to do with metaphors. So that will be the obvious difference. But yeah, this obvious difference has to do as well with the relation that Blumenberg had with Koselleck. Blumenberg was discussing with Koselleck about concepts precisely. So the history of conceptuality cannot be historized without taking into account the role that metaphors play in the construction of concepts. But at the same time, so this will be the frame into which we can state that there's a radical difference. But at the same time, you mentioned that this radical sociology had to do with images such as these enemy-friend distinction. So I was wondering what kind of thing is that? Because it's not a metaphor, according to Schmidt himself, but it's like an imaginary or something, so to say. So maybe if we clarify what's exactly this radical sociology for Schmidt, it can become clear, at least to me, where are the links between the meaningful links between Blumenberg and Schmidt. And for Cesar, just provocative question. Would you say, you mentioned during your presentation, you quoted Heidegger, and you said that for him, well, the idea was that theology is only possible if we have this philosophical background as a possibility. So my question is precisely this: would you agree on saying that for Heidegger, philosophy, at least his philosophy, is a sort of precondition, like a sort of transcendental realm to develop theology? And what kind of theology? Like a Christian theology or other, like a different kind of theologist? So that's it. Who wants to begin?
Right. Do we gather more questions, or is
Let me see.
too much?
Let me see if we have questions.
Yeah. Wait.
I think you need to go like on the page. Sorry? On the page. YouTube. Okay.
And I think not. Okay. No.
Go on.
Okay. I will answer and maybe I can use my turn to make some questions. I find very interesting what you're saying because you spot my structuralist mind, right? No, he has very clear that beyond how we name the terms, in Levi-Strauss, the problem is about verticality and horizontality in metaphors and metonymical movements, right? But beyond that, I would say that what is at stake is the very space of the movement. It's not only, for example, I was giving the other day the example of music. You can compose very different types of music, but there is some a priori or some virtual space which allows you precisely to go horizontally, very schematically speaking, horizontally the melody and vertically harmony, right? And you can modify that to speak in terms of different logics. The transcendental space of music in Indian composition is different because you are allowed to choose semitones between would take notes as points to be. So what I find interesting of metaphors is not, I don't care precisely about the definition of metaphors, but rather showing the problem of the space. And which are our tools precisely to that, to make links from one direction to the other, to establish borders, and to show that eventually there is no difference in general. There are different differences, right? And that is what allows different logics to be possible, different differences. But I want to say something else, and it will be linked to you. There's this guy which is called Nagarjuna, which is this Indian thinker of the 8th century. And he, in Buddhism, you also have something which could be kind of similar to Gelassenheit. What? In his, he has a trick. He's called verses on of the middle way, something like. Sorry, I was some smula magia macacarrica or something like that. But he says something very interesting, and it has to do with other logics because Nagarjuna is famous for having advanced the so-called tetralemma, which you have affirmation, negation, contradiction, and the tetrium datur as 3 or 4 logical possibilities. And those are the space of life, so to speak. You cannot live in the world of yes and no. What it is you have to go to the limits of the world of what can be said through all possible negations and all. To put it in other terms, you have to walk the whole space of possibilities, and that requires negation and different types of negation. So I don't know, and I want you to say something about this because Gelassenheit, it's not only a term from Eckhart, it's also a term used by Luther in the Bible. Because he says something like, because Gelassenheit will save you from Sünde, or something like that, or problems, right? But it's a way of emptying yourself, but it sometimes seems to me demands you to identify with nothingness, so that nothingness as such is reified. And what I like from Nagarjuna in these verses is that do not fall in love with nothingness, because, and he doesn't use the word Gelassenheit, or the opposite is attachment. You can also become attached to nothingness. And he says it's even worse because you think you're not attaching to anything, but it's worse because you're not seeing that you're even attached to the very notion of not being attached, right? So to become aware of this, you have to understand the space of possibilities, the verticality and horizontality, because the tetralemma is very commonly drawn as a cross. So to which extent is Heidegger attached to non-attachment? Because it seems to me that his obsession, the last metaphysical obsession, is being. He wants so much, he attaches so much to this word. And Derrida says something very nice, like, there won't be just one word, not even Sein. It shouldn't have any privilege. But in as much it has privilege, even if it's devoid of any content and meaning, it remains like the black hole, not the positive sun, but the black hole sucking everything around. That's one of the questions. And to Stephanie, I would like to ask you if you say something like, there were the links Hegeliana and the ex-Hegeliana. Don't you see also something like right Paulins and left Paulins? And which would be the difference in interpretation of Paul to define yourself as left or right? Paul, what? Pauline?
Pauline.
Right? Because I found, what you said about Schmidt, and also taking in consideration what you wrote in this book about Benjamin, seems to me that right and left wing depend on certain interpretation of the theological and of exception, and maybe, and this is just a hint, I don't know, I would really love to hear what you think about, if it has to be with temptation and rushing salvation. It was very funny. Hegel and Schelling and Hölderlin, they used to sign their letters with Reichsgottes auf der Erde. It was very clear that the church, the invisible church, had to be done right now, right here, and that has led somehow to the idea that Christianity is totalitarian, as it demands parousia, and Judaism is not, because God never presents and it's never made flesh. So right now, it seems like there is some tendency to make Christianity metaphysical and Judaism non-metaphysical, but at the same time, and these are your old friends, Zizek and sorry, I'm sarcastic, and Badiou, which make the opposite. They tend to say that the revolutionary is Christian, while Judaism is conservative. And I find that dubious, especially because this it turns politics into, again, a clash of religions. Okay, that's it. That's it. Yeah, that's it.
So now we're accumulating questions. Do you want to, or do you, maybe I answer? And,
yeah.
And I think I want to know, because I think we don't have so much time here.
You can go on.
Anyway, I think, no,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
So if we get very high,
Yeah.
we can be here, no? Yeah, I will try to answer briefly first your question about the if it's a link or an extreme difference between Schmidt and Blumenberg, and I would like to point with the idea that Schmidt was only concerned with mainly concerned with concepts and Blumenberg mainly concerned with metaphors because first of all, I think it's impossible to do a metaphorology without being also concerned about concepts because like the main preoccupation I read in Blumenberg is always this point where the conceptual turns into the metaphorical or needs the image to relieve some kind of void that the concept left open or like if you go into more and more mathematical and precise concepts, then suddenly you are without meaning, huh? And then you need an image to provide some kind of meaning or relation or to be able to identify with anything, create a world, let's say that way. And also the concepts that Schmidt is concerned about are, I think, in this extreme point, in this extreme tension that he demands, this radicalization, also always close to this point. This is my, like, I would have to go further into, but this is like my intuition that if we think of the famous concept Smith was concerned about, enemy, friend enemy, the miracle and the exception, which is this we don't know if the miracle is a concept or the miracle is an image. But it's figures of thought, and somehow the political theological transference or translation is from the miracle to the exception, or possibly from the exception to the miracle. There was a political situation that demanded exception or thinking about exception before, and theologically this was fixed in the idea of the miracle. But anyway, I think both are concerned with both, and I think the difference is more in the sort of political engagement. So Schmidt is very clear about what he says. I'm a Christian. I'm doing, like, as a Christian, I demand this and that metaphysical way to relate to the political happenings. And I think his project is a project of power and a conservative. Like, he's identifying with an existing order, and he sees this order being threatened by political movements that would like to impose a different order. And Blumenberg is, first glance, it gives the impression of not being political at all. It never makes an explicit statement, but I think he has a clear preference for non-monotheistic projects, and I think he sees some sort of democratizing potential in pantheism and politics. Like the mere fact that there not only one, but many gods might exist could be, like, also, though you don't take this substantially as a religious belief, I think he is inclined towards this kind of thought, and but his intellectual endeavor, I think, is more a critical one. In this, I'm going to hint to historicize certain figures of thought and see when, in which moment in history they were connected to power or are not connected to power. So I think I would fix the difference between Schmidt and Blumenberg there. And this somehow also leads me to answer this was many questions. One. Right and left question. There is some interesting things. First of all, Schmidt explicitly opposed the differentiation of left and right.
Yeah.
He said this is something like no radical conceptuality there. It's something like really blurry, and he never said I'm a thinker of the right, and he found it quite like bewildering that someone would really seriously make this connection. Agamben would be maybe a left Pauline, or I don't know to which extent Zizek also, or Badiou and company would identify as left Paulins. I find it dangerous to be a left Paul. But I don't know. It's not my project. I don't have that much to say about it. I get a little bit annoyed when those left Paulins try to abuse figures like Walter Benjamin and try to bring Walter Benjamin, who's especially, I think, anti-Paulinian, into this boat, no, and say, okay, he's one of us, and he also wants the destruction of the law, and because this is like the interpretation of the exception. I think they have, you know, like a kind of anarchist need or desire to destruct all order. But then, there is theological debates that say it's not really destruction; it's deactivation, which is not the same. But let's not get into this because it's a huge field. And then, the thing with Paul and the end of times. I mean, there was the narrative goes like this: Christ died, and there is the guarantee of the parousia, no? The second coming. And then what apparently moved Paul to formulate a different theology was a supposed laziness in political activity, and also, I mean, there are sort of stories that people like stopped to have children because they were just waiting for the Messiah to come again, and they were like waiting for the coming of the end of days, so they stopped activity. And then theologically, they had to formulate an answer to this passivity, and this was the catechon idea, you know? Okay, no, wait. The end of days is for sure going to come, but also the Antichrist maybe coming before that. So we need to stop the Antichrist. This is the idea. While in Judaism, there's no catechon, there's science, the one who fights the Antichrist. And maybe I will end with a very general remark about this. I don't like to play out Christianity and Judaism against each other, because it's actually impossible to separate them. Christianity is exactly one stream in Judaism, and then also theologically there has been made a pragmatic cut. For example, we have this movement Gershom Scholem wrote about in the 17th century, Shabtai Tzvi, who was accepted as the Messiah by half of the Jewish world population, like 1 million at that time. And he is still considered like this stream of preaches redemption through sin, and actually like really the harder stuff than Christianity is still accepted as Jewish mysticism. Like no one said that, no, this is not Judaism anymore, because they did not constitute themselves against Judaism. So yeah, I don't like to make the cut, and I think there is emancipatory potential in probably both religions. So I think it's kind of caricaturesque to say, yeah, Christianity is only power and Jesus is only freedom and scripture.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, those are very complex questions. You were supposed to help me with my question, not introducing more products. But that's good. Our job is to find problems. Well, first, when Heidegger criticizes figures like logic, like science, in this case theology, he's not saying that they are not true or that they are false, they are not correct. He's saying that there is a more originary foundation for them. And this is the case for theology. If we consider a standard definition of theology as the logos of the revelation of God in the faith, in the clarification of the faith about that revelation, Heidegger would say that for every revelation to be possible, not only the revelation of God, but also the revelation of things, we need a space, a void space, a open space for things, for entities to reveal themselves. And this is the case of God. So Heidegger is saying, from my point of view, that theology, standard theology, Christian theology, only consider the fulfillment of the revelation, but not the previous space necessary for that revelation. So the thinking this space, this void, would be close to this eschatology of being, since being is this space, this void, and maybe this tries to the question of Arturo. But I don't know if I answered what you asked.
There was the main point was, is he referring to philosophy as the precondition?
No, not philosophy, because not philosophy
In general, of course.
general, yes, but yes, the thinking of this Lichtung, this space for the nation of all beings. Though all those other figures, theology, science, and they presuppose this space. But the task of thinking is to think this open space.
Okay.
Well, and now about what Arturo said, there are also many questions which you pointed out, but you asked if Heidegger is attached dangerously to this nothing, and I would say yes, in some very moments, Heidegger is attached to this space, which I am talking about, forgetting the entities, for example, forgetting human suffering, the concreteness of human beings. No? That's a criticism that, as for example, Herbert Marcuse pointed out in his young lectures of Heidegger. He said Heidegger is forgetting this concreteness of human existence. No, and I agree with that. So the problem here is that, as I said before, the task of thinking for Heidegger is to think this open space, this void, this nothing. But the challenge, the big challenge here is not to assume this void, this nothing, as a fulfillment, as a statical nothing, but it is dynamical. There is a movement here, and this movement is what sometimes Heidegger forgets. Sometimes, not always. And so that's why I am very interested in this figure, this English word, without. Because I have always liked very much this work because it has at the same time this without. There are both directions in the without. We don't have that. Yeah, we don't have this duality in Spanish word sin, one, neither, but the word without it is very interesting. So there is movement here in this voice. There are from the divine to the earth. That's the fourfold with which Heidegger is thinking. Which, by the way, reminds me this concept that you used in, I don't know how it was,
Tetralema or campus forte.
It reminds me a lot of the fourfold Heidegger. But precisely the challenge in Heidegger is not to think only in one part of both, but the game and the complexity and the conflict between them. That's what I would say to your question. There are more things.
La comida.
Yeah, we are like 10 minutes. How do you say that? We have used 10 minutes more of our time. We can conclude our panel here. Unless someone wants to say something else. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for this first day of discussion. We will continue tomorrow at the same.
No, at 10.
At 10. We will begin at 10. And if you are watching this on YouTube, it's going to be the same transmission channel.
Yes, same channel.
So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Que por cierto, fíjate que esta cuestión del pensamiento judío